director of the Holmes Group of companies. He has worked in New Zealand, the UK, and the US, and is currently based in Christchurch. John is a distinguished fellow of the Institution of Professional Engineers of New Zealand and a life member of both the New Zealand Earthquake Engineering Society and the New Zealand Structural Engineering Society. Following the February 2011 Christchurch earthquake, John served as principal engineering advisor, and during this time he took a lead role in the development of the guidelines for the assessment of earthquake-affected buildings. He has had extensive involvement with a number of Christchurch landmarks, including the Town Hall, old government buildings, Arts Center, and of course the Christchurch Cathedral. So John, thank you so much for joining us today from New Zealand, and we look forward to hearing your remarks. But for now, here are just a few slides to set the stage here in Washington State. Okay. So, as many of you know, February 28th, 2026 marked the 25th anniversary of the Nisqually earthquake just a couple weeks ago. So the Cadillac Hotel, pictured here, really became the poster child of the danger unreinforced masonry buildings posed. But it also became the poster child for the power of historic preservation and community advocacy. So hopefully you all have been to the Klondike Gold Rush Museum, which officially opened in October 2005, following nearly 4 years of planning and rehab work to the Cadillac Hotel. And this shows, of course, that project or that building in its post-rehab phase. So following the Nisqually quake, the community was clear on its desire to save the Cadillac Hotel, but the event also taught us about things we need also, not just the things we want. For sure, we need structural engineers. The Cadillac would not have been saved without the ingenuity of the many engineers who worked on this project, both local and folks from out of state. Next slide, Christy. But we also need information as well. And this leads to some of the more recent efforts to inventory and catalog URMs, or unreinforced masonry buildings, across the state. So in 2018, the Washington State Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, or DAP, worked with our Department of Commerce to survey URMs. And the study identified nearly 4,500 suspected or possible URMs across the state. So what's helpful is that DAP took this data and developed a URM dashboard. And I do have to make the disclaimer that because of the survey methodology, the dashboard, the info on this map should not serve as a substitute for any site-specific investigations to confirm URM status of buildings included on the map. So it's a snapshot. It helps us understand where potential buildings are, but it shouldn't be used as confirmation that every site listed is a URM. But the map is useful in that it can filter by categories as well, such as type of masonry material. Is it brick? Is it stone? By building use, is it government? Is it public assembly? And also by historic status. So with the latter, we know that nearly 750 of the buildings on the map are listed in the National Register of Historic Places or the Washington Heritage Register. Of course, we estimate that many more included on the map are actually eligible for historic designation because really just about every URM is over 50 years old and therefore meets the age criteria. So next slide, please, Christy. Now, of course, Seattle has one of the highest densities of URMs in the state and has been actively taking measures to address URMs for a number of years. So between 2008 and 2009, there was a technical committee composed of structural engineers who developed proposed retrofit standards, something we really did not have for addressing URMs. In 2016, the city commissioned a report that found there were an estimated 1,160 URMs citywide. Now, a fair number of these have been retrofitted at least to some degree, if not entirely, but the study did conclude that 17% of that number are one-story commercial buildings that have not been retrofitted at all. So it gives us some idea of the building types. These aren't all just 10-story buildings. They could be as modest as a one-story brick building. In 2024, the city, through the existing building code, adopted a voluntary pathway for URM retrofits that essentially can remove a building from the URM list. If you do X work, that building can then be, quote unquote, delisted as a URM. And then a joint resolution that actually passed back in 2021 actually directed the development of a mandatory seismic retrofit program for URMs in Seattle. And the city does maintain a really good website that has all this information. You see the link there below. Okay, next slide, Christy. But here's the challenge with a mandatory program. How do you pay for it? There have been several efforts to create grant programs or look at other mechanisms over the years, but they have faltered in the legislature. And really, the reality is there's not a grant program that could be created that is even remotely large enough to deal with the scale of the issue. In 2025, House Bill 1810 was introduced, and this is the last legislative effort. It was an effort to require the Department of Commerce to conduct a study on possible incentives to reduce the financial burden associated with URM retrofits. The study sought to look at existing programs we have here in the state, like special tax valuation for designated historic resources, expansion of the state's current use taxation program, and other potential incentive-based solutions. The bill also tasked the Emergency Management Department to complete an inventory and categorization of URMs statewide. But, as many of you on the call know, the state has an incredibly challenging budget situation, and the bill failed to make it out of committee. And so it will need to be reintroduced in 2027 if the proponents want to move this forward again. So this is just a bit of context of why URMs are top of mind for us here in Washington. And now I am pleased to turn it over to John to show us how the earthquake in Christchurch and the aftermath of the event might inform our path here moving forward in Washington. So John, I'll turn it over to you.
Right, thank you very much, Chris. Just bear with me a second. I think hopefully you are all seeing my screen now. Yes.
It's up, yep.
Yep, great, thank you. So yes, thanks Chris for that introduction. I should start with a brief warning. I've got a minor speech impediment. Despite my years in the US, I still speak with a Kiwi accent, so I can promise it'll be a little bit fast maybe, and there might be one or two words you don't understand, but I'll do my best to remember. I've got a lot of slides here, so I'll try and go through fairly quickly, but hopefully, as Chris said, we'll have time at the end for questions. First question you might well ask, and I'm just make sure I'm advancing. Why ask a Kiwi this? Well, I think some of that you've already heard. Certainly, we've been through a lot of similar experiences, and obviously down here in Christchurch, we had our own earthquake a few years ago. From my perspective, I've got 40 years almost of working on heritage buildings in one place or another. Across all the places I've worked, I've been deeply involved, I think, in some of the work we've been doing in New Zealand around how we can fix these buildings, understanding the risks, understanding some of the problems. And believe me, most of the problems we've got are the same ones I think you have. I was in San Francisco when we were sort of through the height of the UMB ordinance era, I think. I well recall, I think, sitting in the back of the room when the first prosecution was made by the city of owners who hadn't done what they needed to. And it really was a striking point that underlines, I think, what Chris was just saying, that a lot of the challenges are in funding. We know what to do. Can we afford to do it is the question. And as Chris has already explained, I was deeply involved in Christchurch. I had, one way or another, moved back to Christchurch in 2006. I was here through the years leading up to the earthquake and ever since. And certainly it was a very formative experience for a lot of people, not just me. From a Holmes perspective, as I said, we were in San Francisco back in 2000 and got established there. You've now got Dan Beck up in Seattle carrying on the good work, as it were. And through that experience in the earthquakes, this was my sort of uniform at the time. Getting around a city post-earthquake is not that easy, as you sort of saw hints of there. I was involved. Here I am with a, dare I say it, a loaned fire service jacket, which was my way of getting in and out of the city past the cordons while we were doing all the work there. It was a very deep experience, I guess, in what can happen in a major disaster. So further context, well, here we are. I'm sure you've all seen this a million times, but the Ring of Fire, which is really what creates this issue. New Zealand, you can see down there onto some of the red dots, but we're essentially at opposite ends of the same problem. We are, in the case of New Zealand, our country was pushed up out of the sea by the earthquakes. Hopefully it doesn't get pushed under again, but that's how we came to be, and that's why we've got this problem. In Christchurch back in the day, this was a trace of all the earthquakes we experienced through that 2 or 3 year time frame. You can't really see it, but I'm hoping you can see my cursor in there. Sort of somewhere buried in the middle of those red dots is the earthquake that caused most of the damage. And so we had a sequence of major events. The first one in September, the green star off on the left, and that was quite a large earthquake, relatively speaking, the largest magnitude earthquake of the series, but not the one that caused the damage. That was the one we had on February 22nd, 2011. Only, we say, a magnitude 6.3, but it was right under our feet. Very shallow, very close to the center of the city, very close, dare I say it, to my house, for that matter, and caused a lot of damage around the city. And contextually, if we look at, this is what you'd be a lot more familiar with than me, but looking back as we do on the Nisqually earthquake, that was a little further away, a little deeper, but still caused significant damage, as you saw. And of course, that relates also to another thing we have in common between Christchurch and Seattle, which is not great conditions underfoot. So that the soils have a major impact on what happens through the events. Rolling forward and looking at a quick comparison of our two countries, New Zealand, population of 5 million, Washington State 8, similar scale. Christchurch, about half the size of Seattle. What I thought was really interesting when I put this together is thinking about how it is that, the non-Indigenous settlement of our different zones was about the same time. In the case of Seattle, it was backed by lumber and gold. In the case of Christchurch, it was agriculture, but very much a case of settlements happened at the same time. And actually, a lot of our architecture, I think, dates back to the same period because we both had sort of early formative experiences which set our countries, our cities up to be what they are. If I look at Christchurch, here are some historic photos. This goes back to 76, but you'll see there fairly typically 2 to 3 story unreinforced masonry buildings, which won't look that different, I think, from a lot of what I've seen around Seattle. Another view of that a little more recently, but again, the same sort of picture. 2, 3, 4, maybe even 6-story masonry buildings. And if I look at another streetscape here, we've got Christchurch on the left, Seattle on the right. You could be in either place when you were taking those photos. So we have a lot of very similar building types. There are some differences, but for the main part, an unreinforced masonry building is an unreinforced masonry building in our experience. Rolling forward, it all kicked off, I'd say in 2010, but really 2011. And this is a famous photograph from shortly after the first of the shocks, just showing the first sign of the devastation. All that dust kicked up by all those buildings and all the things that got shaken loose. It was a major event for a city. All the scenes that we might expect to see in a city after that. Lots of rubble in the street, fallen facades, fallen masonry. In the bottom right there, buildings hanging off the side of cliffs which had collapsed, and the urban search and rescue teams pouring into the city to help recover. It was a significant recovery effort, and we had teams from all over the world came in to help. Oops, that wasn't the right thing. Moving on, so I'll just go back a step because we seem to have gotten out of sequence there. Apologies for that. Hopefully you're seeing four buildings or 4 pictures on a page. Yep, good. And so, as you can see, a lot of impact to heritage buildings. And so here there are a couple of, there's the old Roman Catholic Basilica, bottom right-hand corner, now gone. the Methodist Church on Durham Street, I think, top left-hand corner, now gone. And the more mundane, run-of-the-mill two-story buildings massively affected by this. So it was a devastating effect for our heritage buildings in Christchurch. Let's make sure I'm in the right place now. One of the things which came through, which was perhaps an interesting observation, was also how this effect is not so much instantaneous, or not just instantaneous, but also a gradual impact. So here's a building which was not so far from my house, actually, in Sumner, just an ordinary reinforced masonry building. And you can see just the start of some cracks after the first earthquake in September 2010. Here we are after February 2011, which, remember, was the major shock. And certainly there's a bit of damage there, but it looks recoverable. But in the many earthquakes that followed, that gradually deteriorated. June 2011 was another one of the major shocks, and now the building is looking completely a whole lot worse damaged, and you can see offsets starting to happen of the major load-bearing elements, and the building is a write-off. And so part of our experience there was it's not just the main shock which gets you, it's the aftershocks as well. It's a devastating event. The larger buildings, even ones with a reasonably substantial structure behind them, as you see on the left there, are also fundamentally damaged. Another building we've lost. But on the right there, I'm happy to say we also had some success stories. So those are two buildings which I will come back to later, but buildings which, even after such a major event, came through looking in pretty good shape. I can't tell you exactly when those photos were taken, but certainly post-quake, and not necessarily that long post-quake. Looking at this all from the air, this is Christchurch, I think back in about 2007. I can't see a date there. But anyway, pre-earthquake. And like any city, there are a few development sites, there are a few car parks, but there's an awful lot of, the city is reasonably well built out. And if you look in the center there, which is really where most of the unreinforced masonry buildings were, a lot of the ones that we think of, you'll see a typical city, lots and lots of buildings. Here we are in about 2013, 2014, and you can see a very different picture. Lots and lots of empty spaces, lots and lots of car parks, not a lot else. And if you look at that orange arrow I've got a view here looking up the street, and this is what we had. A very grim picture indeed. You can see in front of us, right in the foreground there, there's a heritage facade being held up by some ballasted containers. You can see a few other older buildings around. You can see some which are clearly derelict and were therefore probably yet to be demolished, and lots of open spaces. And that's what we were faced with. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that, which exclude just the fact that the buildings were badly damaged, which I won't go into, but insurance had a major part to play in this. But certainly the city was fundamentally changed by those events. It wasn't just about the buildings. We don't need to dwell on this, but certainly there are a lot of other things happened. We had a royal commission on the left there to sort of investigate this and talk about why these things happened and what we need to change because of that. And that set a lot of a significant chain of events followed that around thinking about how we might deal with this better in the future, what we might do about it. The three slightly furtive-looking people at the top right were the politicians came to town. They made the mistake of telling us it would all be fixed in a few years. That wasn't right, and those of us who knew it were aghast at that. And at the bottom right, well, the insurance industry had a major part to play. The gentleman on the right was one of the insurers. The gentleman on the left was clearly an unhappy customer, and there was a lot of that went on over those years. So that was the picture. The scene, I guess, is set for what we want to really talk about. I always like to put a quote from a wiser person than me, in this case, Albert Einstein's, I'm happy to say, so a lot wiser. But that whole thing about if we don't learn from what happened, then it was pointless. And so the question is, what do we wish we had done that we hope you might do? Which I think is the key question here. Well, as I said, it's not all bad news. There was also some good news. Some of the interventions that have been tried before the earthquake certainly had an important impact. A lot of buildings had steel strongbacks in them. There was one particular engineer who did a lot of that work. And in many cases that worked pretty well. At the very least, as you see at the top in the middle, it held the roof up if the wall was no longer there. And so there was a major benefit to that. Steel frames inserted in buildings, well, that cute little building, the picture there, had been retrofitted about 10 years before the earthquake, I think. And what I would have thought was some fairly spindly steel frames actually did a pretty good job for that particular building. And so unhappily, they still haven't found a use for it, but happily it is still there. There were various different forms of reinforcing went to these buildings. So be it, in this case, reinforced mortar on the side of a building. In this case, you can't see it, of course, but inside this building, there was, we had put fiber reinforced polymers, so essentially structural wallpaper, which looks a little like this when it's going up, which was quite useful and really made a big difference for that particular building. And I will come back to those buildings also at a later point. But the thing I really want to get to is this, because this is the most important intervention you can make. It's by far the cheapest one, and it really has the most positive impact. And it's those tyres you see. Maybe not the most handsome tyres in the case of this building. This was a pretty ordinary industrial building. I can't tell you exactly where it was, but certainly you can see it had there was some benefit from having it. And this picture is quite useful because it illustrates the point quite nicely. If you look at the gable right in front of you, it's got lots and lots of tyres poking out the end of it. If you look at the one next to that, you won't see anything. So in other words, for reasons I don't understand, they hadn't tied back all the gables, but the impact was clearly obvious. A little more subtlety, if you look at the right-hand side of the gable immediately in the foreground, you can see that there are only 2 ties there, whereas there are a lot of ties coming down the left-hand side of it. And that illustrates another point, which is that it's important you have enough ties in there. And you can see why if you look at the gable. Clearly there was what we think of as a south light truss, but the roof lights impacted where the purlins were they could tie to. So it wasn't the best of roofs to tie to, but certainly where they had enough capacity to put in plenty of ties, it was very effective. And that's really probably the most important message I could give you. If we look at this gable, you can see that point really re-emphasized. If you look at that gable there, you can see just a few ties poking out into thin air, I hope. And really, you can see that it had no difference to the outcome than the gable on the right of that, which had no ties at all. So once again, because they were probably in different ownership, the buildings had different treatment. But the treatment wasn't really of any benefit. And that's because possibly, they had an engineer there to tell them that if the load is only so much, then you only need to put in so many ties. A good example of where engineering is perhaps not helping as much as it might have. And so the real message there is if you're not going to do enough, you might as well do nothing. But if you can do enough, you can save something, even when the demand it might have been designed for is a hell of a lot more than you thought. It's not really about the numbers. It's about making sure there's a basic, simple load path so that when the element that you need to secure, in this case, the facade or the parapet, is being shaken, there is something there to tie it back to the roof. Even if the roof is not the strongest in the world, it will make a big difference. And to show you how much difference I think it can make, I've got an example, which is maybe not the most obvious one, but to me it's sort of the poster child of how this can work. So this is a building which I think of as Smith's Bookshop. Smith's was a well-known second-hand bookshop in Christchurch, pre-earthquake. It's now relocated, but it used to be in this building. So the picture on the right, obviously from our good friends at Google Earth, but there's that L-shaped building in the middle. And Smith's Bookshop was one of the tenancies in there. I think it's probably number 131. But this building had everything wrong with it. If you ask an engineer what the worst configuration of a building is, they'll say it's an L-shaped building, and this is an L-shaped building. It's unreinforced masonry, or it was. And what you can't see in this is that all of the street frontage, all around the way around both sides of the L, was open. And so here's the building after the first earthquake, the magnitude 7.1 out at Darfield. So not the worst earthquake to hit us, but as you can see, it did a fair bit of damage to the building. You can see that most of the parapets fell off, and you can see at this end that the facade was lost in one of those buildings. Now, we knew this building quite well because we had been working with the local Heritage Association to try and get all of the owners of each of these different units to tie these buildings together and to do a collective strengthening scheme, which would have been great. What you can't see from this, but the condition of the one on the right was dreadful even before the earthquakes. All sorts of water damage, all sorts of problems. And so we were hardly surprised by the outcome. But as you can see, some fairly intensive damage all the way through, and the building was cordoned off. Now I want to show you the same building after the February 22nd earthquake, and that's literally right after the earthquake. And so you can see that the damage is no different to the building on the right, of course. The parapet was removed that was remaining on top of the one in the middle. But if you look on the ground there, you'll see just a few bricks on the ground. You'll see that the elevated work platform is still under there, undamaged. The building is pretty much has had no further damage, despite the ones you can see further up the street. And I can assure you it got a lot worse even further back up the street. You can see that it was really came through almost unscathed compared to what it had been. And the reason, some of the reasons, you can see running along here, a wooden whaler, which was tied back through into the building. What you can't see is all the elastic bands and straps back in the building, which literally held it together, and some of the other ties which were put in, which also had that effect. What's interesting to me, and from a structural engineering perspective, you look at this and you'd say, why is that? We had a much bigger earthquake. The building was hideously torsional because it had this soft story arrangement, and yet it's still standing there quite happily with nothing more than those ties. And the reason is because those simple ties made a massive difference to the building's ability to survive such an event. So we look at that, say, despite the fact that it had a soft story, and you can see a different shot of the building here on the right, not a very good angle, but you can see all the way around that there was not much to hold the building together. That facade is the same as the facade down the left. Despite the soft story, despite the irregular L-shaped plan, no significant further damage, and the building could have been restored from this condition. Unfortunately, it wasn't. And that teaches us exactly what I've been saying. You can do a lot with a few simple interventions. They don't need to cost a lot because it's just those ties. It doesn't even need a whole lot of engineering. In fact, if we let the engineers loose on this, they'd have wanted to put frames in at the ground floor to prevent that soft story failure. But the reality is the thing that makes the biggest difference is the ties that hold the walls back to the floors and the roof. Without even strengthening the floors of the roof, you get a lot of benefit right away. And so I really want to emphasize that point a lot. The simplest intervention, put those ties in and you'll have a huge difference in outcome. I would say, very, very important though, to make sure that those ties are done well. There were an awful lot of adhesive anchors, such as the ones that you can see in this picture, left sticking out the edges of the buildings with a bit of brick dust on them because the QA didn't go in to make sure that they were done properly. And so, what do you need to do? Well, muzzle your engineers. Don't let them over-engineer the solutions. Get those simple, cheap interventions done as quickly as you can. Get the basics right. And make sure you invest in that third-party inspections, those third-party inspections, so that you get the basics done well. So once again, it's not about the engineering. Now, this picture on the right is one that's a little bit dear to my heart. Like, I think, Washington State, and interesting to see that plan, that map, at least that Chris put up earlier. We have a lot of other earthquake-prone buildings around the country, and I'll come to what that means in a minute. We have a lot of other unreinforced masonry buildings everywhere. Fielding, which is where this picture is taken, is where I grew up as a child, a long way from Christchurch. We've done a similar mapping to what Chris showed, and we figured out that in Fielding we have 92 unreinforced masonry buildings, which came as a surprise to me because I didn't even think we had 92 buildings. And that's really where we get to the fundamental issue for a lot of these buildings, that if you go through and order strengthening, which is unaffordable, you're going to end up with parking lots because eventually owners will be forced to demolish their buildings as opposed to saving them. Now, the headline up here was part of my attempt at the time to get the message across in Fielding and elsewhere, which is to say you don't need engineers, you need carpenters. You need people that can install those basic fixes, and with the most rudimentary of engineering planning, they can go through and make a big difference. So once again, I'll say it, simple interventions work, don't cost a lot, and need to be done. And for the sake of that other engineering, which we might get to in time, I'd say don't let the perfect get in the way of the good. If we wait until we have the money to pay for the major interventions, we'll miss the opportunity to do the minor stuff, which makes the most difference. So now I'd like to change pace a little bit and go to some case studies, which I think will help illustrate that point further. This is a very well-known complex of buildings in Christchurch. If any of you have been there, I hope you've visited the Art Centre. It's a wonderful set of neo-Gothic buildings. Not quite the brick buildings and not quite typical of the sorts of things that we'll see on the main streets of all our towns, but nevertheless an important set of buildings. And if you look at a site plan, I think there's 18 or 20 buildings there. I never remember the number, but lots and lots of buildings built over a long period of time from about the 1880s forward to early part of the 1900s. And most of them, like the picture I just showed you, beautiful old Gothic stone buildings of about 2 to 3 stories. It used to be the university back in the early days. The university moved out because they ran out of space at some point. And eventually it passed over into public ownership. There was no initial purpose to it. And once it was passed over into that trustee ownership, it became the Art Centre as we know it today. We were involved from an early days in that, before I even joined Holmes. So it's a very, very long period of time, since 1980. And from those early days, we started out on what we called a 3-stage process. The first stage was basic securing, exactly what I just described to you. That was followed through to stage 2 of fixing up the bits and pieces, the finials, the crest, the mullions, the other elements which were the facade, which were the heritage elements, but the ones which weren't going to cause a significant life safety. And finally, we'd go on to fully strengthen the buildings if and when we had the money to do so. This is some early documents I found recently. And looking back, you'll see there's some numbers, not very big numbers. And that was the costs as they were being measured on the way through to do that work to these buildings. Now, these are obviously 1982 dollars, which are a little different value now. But essentially, the message was not a lot of money had to be spent. One or the other of our Holmes engineers would walk through the site on the way to work in the mornings, point their arms to various things and let someone get on with it. And so you can see their work to complete, 250,000 at that point. So what we figured out, 392,000 at that point, which was roughly 1.35 million in today's dollars to do all that tying work. Hence my point, it doesn't cost a lot. This is what we saw, at 7:30 a.m. It says that the earthquake was at 4:55 from my memory. This was the second phone call I made and the first visit I made, so I had to wait for the sun to come up to take these photos. But as you can see, not a lot of damage after that first earthquake, which was great. There were various things happen, but I think that gable on the right really tells the story. There's the tie, and we certainly saw the capping stones loosened, and we were working our way around the place after the event to make sure that we did as much work as we could to fix those up. On the left-hand side, you can see a turret, and you can't quite tell, but that middle area there, you can just see a bit of movement, and I'll come back to that. But essentially, the buildings came through well. Now, we did find evidence of damage and movement, and so we did make the effort to get around there and do a lot of work. So you can see up on the left, people putting timber whalers on or mullions on the outside of the building. You can see on the right, and this was the work on the inside that we were tying that back to. I said the other day, I think some of the most useful work I did as an engineer was probably to be on the hammer and the saw trying to help do this stuff. We were moving quickly to try and get things done. And that turret I showed you a few minutes ago, we figured in the end that for its own safety, we better pull it off the building. And it was fortunate that we did. That was December 2010. Here's the aerial shot in February 2011. Now remember, those buildings are heavy, heavy stone masonry buildings, unreinforced, lots of them. But if you look at that aerial shot, you can see there just those few places where there was some significant damage. Now, one of those, the one I've got my cursor on at the bottom of the screen, was the most unfortunate, where that was a building that we were in the process of completing the securing works, and unfortunately the observatory tower collapsed. But otherwise, we lost some gables, we lost some of the finials, some of the crest and adornment. The tower I showed you a minute ago was on left-hand side. You can see the cap there, but it was perfectly safe. Would have otherwise gone through the roof of one of the most important buildings. And looking around the site, yep, there was damage, but it was savable. And so for the sake of that $1.35 million worth of expenditure, we managed to save probably one of the most important historic precincts in Christchurch. Changing scale a little bit, this is the old government buildings, which we did strengthening work on back in the 90s. I won't spend so much time here because it doesn't illustrate the point so well, but once again, one of those buildings, it fell into disuse, was bought by the city and strengthened at the time for 3.1 million. It was in dreadful condition, as you can see there, held together by a few bits of string, basically, and a very, very heavy unreinforced masonry floor plan. We broke out bits of that and put in some reinforced concrete cores, which are those red areas there, and a little bit of concrete round. But we were able to save the heritage by really focusing the strengthening in the back of the building. And the net outcome of that was that we really saved an awful lot of the building, and it really took what would be otherwise have been potentially demolition, but certainly major repairs back to something relatively manageable. Says there the cost of repairs was 11.3 million, but the 32 million equivalent new building would not have been a beautiful heritage building such as we've got there. It would have been basic accommodation. This one, though, it was one of the ones I had up on the earlier screen, was really one of my favorites. It was a simple little building. We did a lot of work on this pre-earthquake. You can't really tell, but it held up the building next to it, and that was it after the earthquake. Able to reopen right away as soon as people were allowed into that part of the city. Why? Ask, well, it was just simple. Those simple little buildings are easy ones to deal with, easy ones to fix. Moving on, we're a bit like you, I guess. We have the legislators to come along and deal with things. And so what's the role of that? Well, hopefully to enable, but not always. If I look at our history of building regulation, this goes back to 1968, I think was the first time that legislators tried to do something about earthquake-prone buildings. I'll come to that. And so we've got the sequence of earthquake regulations being passed every so often. And we're right in the middle of doing it again now. You'll hear me talk about earthquake-prone buildings. What is that? Don't worry too much about the stuff at the bottom of the page. Essentially, an earthquake-prone building is an unreinforced masonry building or a larger building with a lot of vulnerabilities which are making it prone to collapse in earthquake. And so not dissimilar to what you have in different ways in the US. A bit like the map that Chris showed you, we've mapped these around the country. We think we've got about 6,000 earthquake-prone buildings up and down the country, and we're still counting. Every time you look, you see more. Not all of the country's been assessed, and the government's estimate when they were looking at this new bill was it would cost about 16 billion to fix these things properly as they thought of it, which is unaffordable. Fielding I talked to you about there is right in the middle, which is where we looked at it and said, what can we do? Well, the answer is we can do a lot more than that. We're currently talking about what we do next in New Zealand, and I'd say it's not yet a very satisfactory discussion. In fact, I was in Parliament yesterday along with a lot of other people talking to the select committee about what they might do, but essentially giving exactly the same argument that I was giving today. You don't need to get too analytical about this. We just need to do simple things to reduce the risk for most of the buildings and reduce the compliance costs. Because the critical problem is that every time those acts are passed, every time the legislators move in and start doing things, if they haven't figured out how it's going to be funded and paid for, it won't happen. And so we've got all these instances where basically the legislation gets rolled back because not enough action has happened, and it's because no one's really given enough attention to the funding. And so like you, we're grappling with the same problem. We talk about tax relief, we talk about grants, we talk about interest-free loans, we talk about all of those things, but you have to get that sorted out to make a difference. very briefly, just at the end, I'll talk quickly about the risk, which I think you probably know about, but I think there's some interesting aspects to it. This was their old fault map we used to work with at around 2000. This is the new fault map with all the researchers have come up with. And essentially, my theory is the top left-hand corner, you'll see there's not that many faults up there. That's just because we don't have a university in that part of the country to find the faults. The more you look, the more you're going to find. And that's not a bad thing. It's important we understand the risk, but the reality is we're in a situation, both Seattle, Washington State, and New Zealand, where there are lots of faults out there. And I would say most earthquakes happen on faults that weren't previously known about. And this is where I come to the only equation, the only piece of engineering equation I'll put in here, which is as simple as the probability of an earthquake is about 1. They're going to happen, it's inevitable. And if you go back to that fault map, the only question we don't know is really, when are they going to happen? But you could look at that fault map and say it's just like that. It's a load of alarm clocks. They're all ticking, waiting to go off. Now that sounds a bit fatalistic. To an extent it is. But I think that's where you get to the important point, which I'm always going to come back to again. The clock's always ticking, but that simple basic securing, which I'll keep hammering, is what makes the most difference for relatively little cost. It can be affordable and it can be done. You don't want to let the engineering overtake the budget. If we start talking about doing too much work to make the buildings too good, then we won't be able to afford it. Whereas if we do those little things quickly, then we'll have a much better outcome. And remember, smaller earthquakes happen more frequently than large ones. And so those are the ones that actually really form a great proportion of the seismic risk that we face in our cities and towns day by day. And finally, that point, which I know it's very hard for us to deal with as engineers, we don't get much say with it, nor as building owners, but really you've got to work with the regulators to make sure you can afford what you're planning to do before you start to regulate to do it. Otherwise, you'll end up in a situation where you can't afford to do it and you kick the can down the road. So final point, I'll just give a bit of credit to a couple of people, many of whose slides or pictures I borrowed. Des on the left that I work with on a daily basis, Jason Ingham, who's a professor up in Auckland. These guys have done a lot of these things. Thanks to them for their contribution. And right on the point of 8:44, I think, or 12:44 in your case, that's the end of the show. So sorry, I rushed through a little bit at the end, but I hope I got the message across. Keep it simple, get it done. And at that point, I will try to stop sharing.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, John. That is, it's sobering, certainly, to see the examples and see the images, but also, I think there's some optimism that can come out of that as well, that the interventions aren't necessarily or don't need to be maybe as big as we sometimes fear they may be. So lots of great stuff, and I really, really appreciate you taking the time to walk through that with us. Do want to open it up. You did great on timing, so thank you. Do want to open it up for questions, and I certainly invite people to put a question in the chat, or if you want to simply come off mute, you can either raise your hand or jump in and ask questions directly of John. And I can also, I have some that I've written down as well, because they the presentation raised a lot of issues. So I can actually kick it off. And that is, this might be an obvious question coming from the executive director of a preservation advocacy organization, but in terms of how well, I won't get too specific with it. I'll just say, how did the historic landmark or heritage landmark ordinances play a role generally in rebuilding, how to recover, how to rebuild in Christchurch? Which particular buildings should be saved? What did any of those, that sort of protection conservation framework play a role, or was it just simply, can we do it or not based on the damage suffered?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, certainly we have similar structures in place. So Heritage NZ were very active post-earthquake to do their best to restore things, to save as many of the heritage buildings as they could. I won't say it was a happy time for them because there was an awful lot lost. And it's a really difficult choice because, you know, I think from the one hand, you want to save everything you can. On the other hand, you've really got to fight your battles in the places you've got the most chance of winning. I think it would have been nicer to have saved more of the typical streetscape that we've lost. You know, it's easy to focus on the important buildings and save those, but if you look at the sort of the more routine streetscape, that also forms a big part of the character of the city, both in the sense of what the built environment is, but also because they provide the spaces for the, you know, the sort of more mundane things. Dare I say it, I've always said that New Zealand would, Christchurch would be complete when the tattoo parlor moved in downstairs in the office, because it's not until you've got that full ecosystem of buildings at all rental scales that you've really got a city back. And, you know, we don't have that right now because a lot of those things weren't saved. And so I think while everyone did what they could, it would have been nicer to have seen more of that, albeit that it's great to see things like the Arts Centre and other of those real landmark buildings coming back.
Great, thank you. Agreed about the that full ecosystem. I like the way you phrase that. There is an ecosystem to a city that is not just the built environment, but the use as well. And we do have a tendency to get stuck on that physical, that built environment. What do all those details look like and say? But it is actually how a place functions, essentially, how it is used by the denizens and visitors to a place that are important. So that's great. Dan, you have a question?
Yeah, John, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how earthquake insurance has played a role, the good and maybe the bad, on preservation of historic buildings.
Yeah, so that's a really important question to understand. And so for whatever reason, Kiwis may be very risk averse or something, but we had massive amounts of insurance in our buildings, earthquake insurance, before the earthquake, almost the inverse of the US, I think. And so somewhere in the region of 80 to 90% of our buildings were insured for earthquake, including, this is the commercial buildings, the city centres, but also across the residential, which I think in the US, from memory, that's much lower, maybe 10, 20%, or maybe even a little less. The impact of that was that all owners who thought they had insurance were you know, very keen to get the best outcome they thought they could. And so, as I would put it, where you go some places and you'd see the owners sort of strapping themselves to the front of their building to avoid it being demolished. I think in Christchurch, people were almost asking for the keys to the digger so they could go and demolish it themselves as quickly as possible. And that was another challenge for the heritage advocates to really try and prevent that happening. But certainly that had a major effect. Now, I doubt that's going to be the same again, because that the insurers are much less likely to insure a lot of the older buildings. So you can't insure an unreinforced masonry building. And that has a tremendous effect also, therefore, on values. There's an effect on occupancy and all those sorts of things. And so it's quite it's changed landscape even since Christchurch in New Zealand, and probably much more like what you have there. But certainly insurance was actually the enemy of a lot of buildings which could have been saved. And that was part of the reason why that map or that aerial.
He's never been successful before. He doesn't know what to do.
It's not too good.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that, John. Yeah, a little disappointing to hear that insurance is the enemy in cases like this. But I can certainly, at times, right? I want to just, this came in the chat, so you can look at it there as well, but I'll read it out loud. This comes from Brandon, who is with the city of Portland, our neighbors to the south in Oregon, but they are, as he notes, on the same subduction zone. And it's kind of a technical question, which I, of course, expect from Brandon. So thanks for the question, Brandon. But he says, it seems that preventing failure above primary egress points is a priority for safety during and exiting after an event. So the question is, have you seen examples of brick-resistant canopies at those primary entries on historic buildings, and maybe even examples that impact historic integrity? So if you have something that's added, I think what he's asking is, are they adding things that might not be historic, but
yeah,
do they work, kind of thing?
another interesting question. I mean, I'd still go back to my earlier points and say, well, two things. One is that, look, if you've tied the facade above those exits is probably the best thing that you can do, because you don't want to have the bricks falling if you can avoid it at all. Second thing being that education is an important point there, because we really don't want people running out of buildings particularly during earthquakes. And in fact, a lot of the loss of life we had around these buildings was exactly for that reason. However, the question is an interesting one, because most of those facades we talk about or think about along the street fronts, there's not really the means to put those brick resistant canopies in place. It's far too intrusive on the sidewalks and the parking. I'm aware of maybe one or two buildings where we had designed exactly that, brick resistant canopies, and I'm both pleased and sad to say they weren't tested. So I'm totally confident they would have worked. And in the particular circumstances I'm thinking about, one was, for example, on a hospital where we had to do something, and so we did do that, but actually the buildings behaved pretty well. It's a tricky one, and certainly if I think of a place like the Arts Centre where we could have done that, it would have made some difference, but I haven't seen a place yet where we would have been able to get away from that, with that from a heritage perspective.
Great. Thank you. I've got another question in here from Nick Gillespie, and he's asking if you could comment as to what extent of collaboration and alignment there has been in the design and construction community towards a common set of solutions that can reasonably be applied to URM buildings typically. Typical solutions that can also be reasonably priced and understood by the industry and public as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, you've just described nirvana. We have been trying that. That shot when I talked about fielding, that was from 2018, I think, which was where with another person or a couple of people, I was trying to get something underway to start that up. And Engineering NZ jumped in, and we sort of had a push at it, but it was just, it couldn't get the funding to piece it together. Now, having said that, there's the current initiative to change the legislation. One of the things that does go along in parallel with that is this process of saying we're going to a more vulnerability and attributes-based assessment of these buildings. We are at the same time trying to develop some guidance to do exactly this. I think the guidance in its current form has just a little too much engineering in it, but we are coming back, I hope, to let's work on those solutions. So exactly as you described there. And there's been an exercise done in Wellington, which got part the way there. So they had the Kaikoura earthquake back in 2016. And there was an initiative immediately after that to deal with a lot of those brick buildings in a certain area of Wellington, which were particularly vulnerable. And they did develop exactly this, I think, pulled together the owners, in that case, pulled together a lot of the builders who were doing it and a few engineers to develop these simple details. I don't think they got it 100% right, but they did the work, and that's the main thing. And so that was a good example of how it can work pretty well, actually. I think give us another year, and I'm very hopeful that we'll have that unreinforced masonry guidance a lot better shape. I'm hopeful we'll have pulled out the intensive engineering and analysis side of it and really work back towards exactly this. So we're on the path. We're just not quite there yet, I think.
Yeah, and that is, I mean, I look back to some of the things over literally the last 15, almost 20 years. Well, since the Nisqually quake here in 2001 that the city's done. And one of the things that came out of this technical committee that was convened again back in 2008 was these proposed retrofit standards and really, what that means is basically the question Nick asked, what can we all agree on as kind of a minimum piece? Now, I was not part of that technical committee, and I don't know. I don't believe those standards have been officially approved overall, but I do know that in 2024, the city did adopt through the existing building code this pathway of how owners of URM buildings can do enough, do what's needed to be technically no longer considered a URM. I think that is a result of some of those standardization of processes. And Dan, you can probably speak a lot more to that than I can with regard to Seattle and how those play a role. But I think we got time for one more question. This comes from Jeff in Olympia, and that is, what non-obvious factors allowed some unreinforced masonry buildings to hold up better than others? Are there factors that just, we don't see off the top of our heads or aren't clear to the layperson?
Yep. Again, a good question. I can give you some idea of that. Just before I do, though, I'll just go back to that last one a little bit and what you just said. To some extent, the details don't matter a little bit. I mean, we can agonize over, is it this, is it that many, is it this many bolts, is it that diameter, is it all those sorts of things. I mean, that's important, but the most important thing we talk about is a load path. A load path is just a fancy engineering way of saying everything holds on to everything else. And so long as we can see that there's that continuity, so that there's the facade, can we trace that continuity back to see that there's something holding it up, which is stiff enough and strong enough to do so, then that's the most important thing. And to some extent, the details of that load path are important, but they're not the most critical part of it. So we don't need to agonize too much over the precise details. We just need to make sure that we've got the basics covered. Now to the question. The biggest non-obvious factor is what's under the ground. If you look around Christchurch, you could almost map the soil types from a damage that happened above the ground. So unfortunately, if you're on not so good ground, then unreinforced masonry buildings tend to get damaged more. If you're on better ground, they tend to perform better. So there's that. And I'm aware, of course, that some of the areas around Pioneer Square, for example, maybe the soil types are not the most favourable, and that's why you probably saw the damage that you showed us previously, and that was also a lot of the story around Christchurch. Having said that, once you recognise that, then you have at least got the ability to sort of think about what we can do to help that maybe in the way that we think about some of these retrofits and the way that we think about some of the other work that we might do. Potentially to prevent that being such an impact. The reason why it's such a big deal is because once you start to get differential settlement, which is to say some parts of the foundation move a little more than others and the building is suddenly stressed up and down as well as sideways, then that's when you start to see the buildings not performing so well. I think other factors which need to be taken into account are maintenance. And unfortunately, a lot of our older unreinforced masonry buildings don't get the level of maintenance they need. And I could say a step further, the real enemy to our buildings in just about every case is water, right? What happens in the 2 minutes of the earthquake might be influenced heavily by what's happened for the previous 50 years of water pouring through behind the facade. So if you have a leak in a building, well, you need to get that fixed as quickly as you can. You need to address that damage, because if things don't do what they should because they're not in great condition, then that will always be a problem.
Great. Well, thank you very much, John. Once again, we are right at 1 o'clock. We've gone right to the end of the hour, and I appreciate almost everybody sticking with us to hear the Q&A. So just the last housekeeping bits, you'll receive a recording of this session. Please feel free to share that with others as well. We have some upcoming webinars. April 23rd, we'll be looking at the new historic preservation and building performance standards that have been passed in the state and are now in place. And then we'll be looking at some tax credit, how to finance tax credits, rehab projects later on this spring. So keep on the lookout for those. And just finally, a huge thanks to John Hare, to Holmes for the presentation. And once again, thanks to the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation and to the National Park Service for helping provide support for us to be able to put these on. So thanks to all of you. Wish you a good rest of your week. And John, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.